Let's understand the Ukraine war better. This conflict that began in February 2022, February this year. What is this war about? Now, if you are a short-sighted person, what do I mean by a short-sighted person? Somebody who sees history or geopolitics or current events from a very narrow perspective. You see it only from the lens of the last 10 years. What happened in the last 10 years? If you have a narrow perspective, you will entirely blame Russia for what happened. Yes. If you look at it from a 50-year or 100-year perspective, or even from a post 1990s perspective, then you will understand where the real blame lies, where the blame really lies, right? Anyhow, so let's understand what the Ukraine war is. And to understand the Ukraine war, you have to understand something called the heartland theory. It is a theory that was put forth by an English geostrategist called Halford Mackinder. So this person, Halford Mackinder, put forth the heartland theory in 1904. This guy died in 1947, right? And he put forth this theory in an article called The Geographical Pivot of History. So now let's take a look at what this is. Let me put something on the screen which will help you understand what I am saying. So this is Mackinder's heartland theory, or is it too small? Let me embiggen or bigify this. One second. Give me a second. Let me bigify, embiggen, enlarge the image. Okay, now it makes a little more sense. So this is the diagram at the heart of this theory. It will help you understand better. So according to Halford Mackinder, the world is divided into several sections. The main section is the so-called world island, which is made up of the interlinked continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa. So this is essentially Eurasia plus Africa. This is what Mackinder called the world island, right? Then he had another section called the offshore islands, which essentially, in according to him, are the British Islands, the islands of Japan, etc. Those are the offshore islands. And then there is a third section of the world called the outlying islands, which are the continents of North America, South America, and Oceania. So you have the world island, you have the offshore islands, and you have the outlying islands. Now he coined this term called the heartland or the pivot area. You can see in this diagram something called the pivot area. So what is the heartland? What is the pivot area? It's the same thing. The pivot area lies at the center of the world island. It essentially is from the river Volga in the west to the river Yangtze in the east. And from north to south, it is the Arctic region to the Himalayas. So that region is what Mackinder called the heartland or the pivot area. And he said that so this heartland has traditionally been ruled by the Russian Empire, later by the Soviet Union, and most of it is still administered, ruled, owned by Russia. Now, what is interesting or important about the heartland or the pivot area? The heartland, the pivot area, contains more than half of the entire world's resources. It's all about resources, my friends. The pivot area contains more than half of the entire planet's resources. What do I mean by resources? I'm talking about raw materials. I'm talking about petroleum products, oil and gas, and minerals and metals, and also agriculture. These resources essentially are everything you need to indefinitely sustain a large, massive military force, right? That is the reason why the Russians have not been affected to a large extent by the US sanctions, because they have all the resources they would ever need to sustain their nation indefinitely and their military power indefinitely. So the heartland, the pivot area, contains more than half of the entire planet's resources. And the heartland is protected from sea power by the Arctic ice at the north and by mountains and deserts in the south. So it is extremely well protected. When Mackinder wrote this thesis, this article, the world's geopolitics was all about sea power. Even today, the world's geopolitics is about sea power. It's about the choke points in the oceans. It's about the trading routes and the infrastructure at sea. It's about major navies, right? At the time Mackinder wrote this thesis, the major sea powers were the UK and the US, and to some extent Germany. Even the French had a sea power, and Japan was also a sea power, right? And today, if you look at the world today, there are two major sea powers: the United States and China, right? So the heartland is protected from sea power by ice to the north and mountains and deserts to the south. That is Russia's natural protection. And this is then what Mackinder said. He said, "Who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. And who rules the world island commands the world." Right? So the key to control of the heartland is East Europe. The key to control of the world island is the heartland. And the key to commanding the world is ruling the world island. So this theory, heartland theory, or Mackinder's the heartland theory, this theory was central to the geopolitics of World War One, of World War Two. It was central to the geopolitics of the Vietnam War and other conflicts, and it was central to the Cold War. And once again, this heartland theory is central to Cold War II and the Ukraine conflict, which we are seeing right now, right? So in Mackinder's analysis, China is what he calls a rim world power. It's laid out on the rim of the eastern part of Eurasia. So China, according to Mackinder, is a rim world power. It is vulnerable to two things. It is first of all vulnerable to the heartland power, the great power in the heartland, which is Russia. It is also vulnerable to the great ocean power, which is the US and NATO. In the past, it was Japan and the UK as well. In today's context, it is vulnerable to the great ocean power, which is NATO and the US. So China is vulnerable to the great heartland power, Russia, and to the US. And the Chinese also understand this, and that is why they have been investing so much on their Belt and Road initiative to connect themselves with the heartland, and also on creating a very powerful navy, which they are still working assiduously towards. So, China, according to Mackinder, is a rimland power. Mackinder makes no mention, as far as I know, about India, which is good, which is fine. So, Mackinder says that the key to controlling the heartland is Eastern Europe, and the key to controlling the entire world island is the heartland, and the key to controlling the entire world, is to control the world island. Right now, the United States, it understands. It takes this theory, heartland theory, very, very seriously. The entire pivot to the Indo-Pacific is essentially based on understanding the heartland theory, and putting various strategies in motion to essentially, in the long run, acquire the heartland. Because the heartland, so according to Mackinder, you may be a sea power or whatever, but the true key to controlling the entire world is to become a land power in the heartland, in Eurasia, in where Russia currently rules, right? So the US today is a superpower which is in decline. And the US has always been a petro superpower. Its rise was predicated on controlling the petroleum reserves of the world, the energy reserves of the world. If the United States wants to remain the dominant great power, the dominant superpower in the world, it has to prevent Russia from securing Eastern Europe. It has to prevent Russia from securing Eastern Europe, because Eastern Europe is the key to the heartland. It is the key to Russia. And Eastern Europe is the only viable path right now for any great power to invade Russia. There are other routes as well, but those are far from becoming a reality. So if the US wants to remain the dominant great power, it has to prevent Russia from securing Eastern Europe. That is key. And if Russia is secure, then its position as the greatest landmass in the heartland will allow it to eventually, in the future, in the long term, to dominate the world. That is the heartland theory of Mackinder. So essentially, once again, let me repeat, according to this theory, whoever controls Eastern Europe will end up eventually controlling the world. Controlling the world. Understand this. This is Mackinder's heartland theory. Now let's move on from this and take a look at the map, because we are talking about geopolitics. And one second, let me put the map on the screen. Give me a second, and we will now understand why Eastern Europe is important and what's happening right now. So, Eastern Europe. We know where Russia is. Russia. East of Russia is Eastern Europe. These are the former Soviet bloc nations, right? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania was, and Belarus, and Ukraine, and Moldova, etc., was all part of the USSR. Poland is Eastern Europe. Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, etc., are more or less Eastern Europe. Slovenia, Croatia was part of the Soviet bloc. Serbia, Albania, all that. Bulgaria, Romania. Right? These are all the various Eastern European nations. The one nation that dominates Eastern Europe, the greatest and largest nation in Eastern Europe, the largest land area of any nation in Eastern Europe, is Ukraine. Therefore, Ukraine is the most important nation geopolitically, geostrategically in the Eastern European region. Right? So, if you want to prevent Russia from becoming a great dominant power, you have to ensure that Russia is not able to secure Eastern Europe. And the key to Eastern Europe is Ukraine. So, the Americans have calculated and they believe that Russia wants to eventually take all of Eastern Europe, or if not take all of Eastern Europe, then establish its uncontested dominance and hegemony over Eastern Europe. That way, the Americans will never be able to defeat Russia. So, the key to defeating Russia in America's eyes is to take control of Eastern Europe. Now, as we know, Poland is more or less, there are many nations in Eastern Europe that have become NATO members, and many nations have expressed the urgent desire to become NATO members, right? Uh, um, and so on. So the Americans have been slowly, steadily, from the 1990s onwards itself, steadily they've been encroaching and expanding eastwards into Eastern Europe. When the USSR broke up in the early 1990s, the Americans were not satisfied with that. They wanted to take over the whole of Russia, right? And for a while it was that's kind of what happened, because under Boris Yeltsin, the Russians opened up their economy to the Americans, and they essentially destroyed their economy willingly. That's what Boris Yeltsin did. And then you had Vladimir Putin, who came to power, who did a 10-year period of consolidation of stopping the bleeding, so to say. And then Russia was back slowly, right, with the conflict in Georgia, with the conflict in Crimea, and now the Ukraine conflict. So the Americans see the Russians as wanting to slowly but steadily regain lost ground and essentially recreate the Russian Empire and what the USSR was. And that would essentially lead to the Russians eventually taking control of the whole world. That's what the Americans think, or calculate, or fear. And that's why the Ukraine conflict is central to the future of the world, right? Because if the Americans are able to prevent Russia from, let's say, conquering Ukraine, or if they are able to make Ukraine regain the annexed territories that Russia has recently annexed, then it could be a disaster for Russia. And eventually they could be, if the Americans can essentially make the whole of Eastern Europe a part of NATO, then they can, as a next step, strike against Russia in a variety of means, right? Especially if they can isolate Russia completely, which is where the dirty bomb angle comes in. If the Russians are accused of detonating a dirty bomb, then even India and China can be greatly pressurized to distance themselves from Russia. Then you isolate Russia, and then step by step you take Russia out. So that is the American grand strategy. So this is all predicated on Mackinder's heartland theory. Who controls Eastern Europe will one day control the world. Right? So this is America's great bid for retaining their dominant status as the world's sole superpower. China is not doing well. I've spoken about this multiple times. The Belt and Road Initiative is dead in the water, and the Chinese economy is crawling right now. They're not even revealing their GDP figures. So China is not going to become a superpower the way they had hoped anytime soon. So that leaves us with Russia. Russia can one day, once again, because of its enormous command, of its command over the enormity of more than half of the planet's resources, they can become a superpower if things go right. The Americans don't want this to happen. So the Ukraine conflict is a pivotal conflict. It is the most important conflict we have witnessed essentially since World War II. That's what's happening. It's a conflict for the future of the world, right? So that's how we need to understand this, and that's why the Americans are taking this conflict so seriously. That's why the Russians are taking it so seriously. It essentially is about the future of Russia as well. If Russia is not able to succeed in Ukraine, it could very much spell the beginning of the doom for Russia. What the Americans would like to do is hopefully not in the long term future take over Russia and its enormous resources. America is a petro superpower, right? And Russia has enormous resources, reserves of petroleum and oil and gas and all those things. If the Americans get access to that, if they can control that, it will guarantee American supremacy for at least another century. So that is what the game is about. The game is about controlling the key to the heartland. The key to the heartland is Eastern Europe, and the key to Eastern Europe is Ukraine. So control Ukraine, then you can control Eastern Europe. If you control Eastern Europe, you can control the entire heartland in the future. It is the gateway to the heartland. It is the gateway to Russia. And if you control the heartland, you control essentially the whole world. That is what the game is about. And that's why this conflict is extremely, extremely important for the entire world.